Africa. Kalle udu sihai. Samayado ipatlela sabo pilo. Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the Energy Security, Regional Crises, and the pending Global Recession episode of Ubuntunomics podcast. This month, in the essay update, we'll take a look at the Renewables Energy IPP Procurement Program, bid window 5 signings and bid window 6 bids, the Expropriation Bill, and the National Labour Migration Policy. In the Africa Regional Update, we look at the ECOWAS challenges in Burkina Faso, Guinea and Mali, the East African community dealing with the Ebola outbreak in Uganda, and the SADC preliminary statement on the elections in Lesotho. And in a new segment this episode, we look at global geopolitics, and we'll be looking at the 77th UN General Assembly and the 2022 annual meetings of the IMF and World Bank. So joining me this month is Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Hello Sbu, how are you doing this month?
No, very well, thanks. Yeah, I can't complain. I won't even complain. I won't say anything about the energy crisis and anything about our situation.
Shame, man. But please join me as we welcome Siyabonga Khatebe onto Ubuntunomics podcast. Siyabonga is a diplomat with a background in public policy, and he holds senior degrees in commerce, international political economy, and international trade law. And Siyabonga is a regular contributor to local and international media. Welcome, Siyabonga. How are you this month?
Thank you, Siyabonga. Sia, there are two Sias now. Yes, Sbu, you're outnumbered for the first time, my brother. Sorry about that. Yes, thank you. It's a great pleasure for me to join you, gentlemen, and I look forward to knowing the ropes and to speaking to the audience and give the news as we understand them.
Yes. No, thanks for joining us. I think for clarity purposes, we're going to stick to referring to you as Khatebe Siyabonga and myself as Sia and Sbu as Sbu. I think that will be a lot easier to keep up, at least for our listeners and the viewers and followers of Ubuntunomics. And
welcome to the team, Khatebe. Welcome to the team, my man.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nyat.
Where are you joining us from this month, Khatebe?
Oh, well, I'm based in Geneva, Switzerland, so I would be doing most of my sessions while broadcasting from the bottom of the Alps. So I'm in Geneva, Switzerland. Yeah.
Great, amazing. Poor Sbu is left alone in load shedding city in South Africa, as I'm joining you gentlemen from Nairobi this month. So how dark is the dark country, Sbu? Or at least now the load shedding should be over, right?
No, it was supposed to have been over last week, but then over the weekend we got another stage 2 announcement. So we ebbing and flowing, and it's that kind of a situation.
You literally are talking about a silver lining in the dark, but I hear you.
No, we can see you, Sbu. We are not.
Sign of the times, gentlemen, sign of the times. And I think on that note, for all our listeners, regardless of where you are listening through, whether it's on iTunes or Spotify or whatever platform you're listening via, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And if you're enjoying this episode, hit the like and share it amongst your family and friends. I think on that note, gentlemen, let's get started on the South Africa update in brief. There's quite a bit happening. The Minister of Public Enterprises appointed a new board of directors for Eskom, and the Minister of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development lifted the foot and mouth disease disaster management area for the Free State. Meanwhile, Germany committed 355 million euros, approximately 6.5 billion rand, for the Just Energy Transition Skills Development Program. And the Department of Tourism opened up a new Green Tourism Incentive Program funding window, which is open until February 2023. Meanwhile, South Africa was elected to the United Nations Human Rights Council on the 11th of October, and the National Township Rural and Informal Economy Symposium was held in East London on the 13th and 14th of October. And lastly, on the 14th of October was the 25th anniversary of the South African Revenue Service. On that note, that takes us to the first story in the SA update for this month, the REIPPPP. Triple P, BW5 window signing and the BW6 bids. So the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, DMRE's Minister, Mr. Gwetamantashe, announced that first signing of 3 projects to sign an agreement under the 5th bid window of the Renewables Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program, the REIPPP, on the 25th of September. So EDF Renewables is the investor in the 3 wind power projects that are going to contribute 420 megawatts renewable capacity to the national grid after their 24-month construction period, of course. The 3 projects are Colescope Wind Power, which adds 140 megawatts near Middelburg in the Eastern Cape, and the Sandkraal Wind Power adding another 140, and Pesgomoya Wind Power adding an additional 140 from near Newport in the Northern Cape. So the DMRE is currently negotiating with the remaining 22 preferred bidders to meet the total of 2,600 megawatts of energy, consisting of 1,600 megawatts onshore wind and 1,000 megawatts of solar PV plants. The DMRE is also received bids under the 6th bid window, BW6, of the REIPPPP, and has published a list of 12 preferred bidders for the 3,200 megawatts wind energy resource and another 13 preferred bidders for the 1,000 megawatts solar PV energy sources. Khatib, what are your thoughts on this one?
Sia, thank you. This seems to be an unending story, and what we are trying to do to get out of the darkness that SBU is currently sitting under. The issue of load shedding and the energy space in South Africa, for me, it's one of the most intriguing phenomenon that is creating a lot of problems for individuals, families, and the economy at large. And in this regard, the renewables are considered an integral part of the energy mix, which to this moment is still dominated by the unwanted coal. And I'm not sure where this is taking us. And I'm saying this because with all the hype around the renewables, in my view, is that they are not going to provide the necessary base load to keep the lights on. And also we have seen in Europe where this idea of renewables originate, that the renewables are not able to keep the lights on again, as the Europeans are scrambling for our coal at the moment, because the taps of Russian gas have gone dry, especially after the pipeline was cut off and other problems. So it is more of the vindication on my side, because I've always been quite suspicious of renewables. But I'm standing to be convinced, gentlemen, whether my lack of faith and enthusiasm about renewables is warranted. But yeah, I think that it's an issue that we are willing to debate. But I'm not sure whether the path that we are taking eventually, even when we have signed all the other bids and other renewable contracts, we are going to get to where we want to get. I would like to understand maybe from you two colleagues. Thanks.
Sure, sure. Look, I don't think we can escape the fact that there are a lot of interests involved in this whole just energy transition. And I think even the global geopolitics now is actually right in the center of it, because what you've seen starting, for example, with Russia as something over, the potential incursion by NATO and, them bringing the military apparatus close to the door of Russia, etc., has now all of a sudden become about the energy security in Europe, and obviously the interest that the US has in Europe unbundling itself from its reliance on gas from Russia. And so what may have started off as something that has been about the global climate change issue, etc., is actually now getting wrapped up in the geopolitics, and now we're seeing the real impact of the interests behind them. Smooth, what are your thoughts?
Man, I would say, in South Africa, the most influential lobby is basically the solar and the wind energy lobbies. I pick out these two because, as Khadibe had said, they are intermittent technologies, which means that they cannot be dispatched every time you switch on the lights. These have not, the two technologies have not assisted Eskom when faced with severe blackouts. There are other alternatives, but now, as you were saying, these two technologies will also take about 24 months to build, which is not a short time, and yet they've been punted as our only rescuers, I mean. The insistence on additional capacity is another quandary. I mean, we have capacity in South Africa, and on average, they say that there's 16 gigawatts is not available due to breakdowns. It makes, therefore, no sense to me at all why we don't concentrate on repairing or maintaining existing plant and going ahead with the energy transition at our own pace. I'm not against the transition per se, but I'm saying there are other technologies. I see also that Minister Mantashe's arm has been properly twisted, because they've been writing all these articles about him, and there's been calls for him to be sacked because he was seen as this cold dinosaur. But I think to understand why a government like ours, which is led by a ruling party which claims to be leftist in orientation, would simply bend over backwards to satiate private interests, and in that process risking sovereign energy security and or going against its own developmental objectives. I think one would need to understand South Africa's investment strategy first. The country's economic heads sincerely believe that a sovereign debt of about 70% is unaffordable, or it is prohibitive. There is this infatuation with leveraging private finance for development, and they say that any higher public debt will crowd out private capital. So we have envoys going right around the globe searching for investors, like in any typical emerging market economy. On face value, these independent power producers, they seem like a boon for our economy, for the government, for the fiscus, because Eskom has been begging national treasury to relieve them of their debt balance sheet, their debt in the balance sheet. They were asking for 200 billion rands of their total 400 billion rands to be financed by the government. So when people talk about these renewable energy private producers, power producers, they think free money. I mean, President Ramaphosa, even this weekend, when he is on a state visit to Saudi Arabia, and in Saudi Arabia, on the sidelines of that official state visit, he's already received a pledge from a utility called ACWA, which has promised to invest 10 billion US dollars in green hydrogen in the next 5 years. And then that company will increase that to 25 billion US dollars by 2030 in other forms of renewable energy. So they see this as easy money. So this is, they're looking for quick fixes. They think foreign investment will buy them some time, but that they need to drill down to the structural challenges that the country faces. This energy crisis will persist if we keep on going this route, because we've tried this wind and solar energy route and it has not worked. But we still have lots of unemployment in the country, and we will still, with these foreign investors, have the exploitation of profits. So I think we could try other avenues like natural gas from Mozambique.
Precisely. Look, one of my biggest sadness about this whole debacle, right, is the fact that our government in South Africa has got zero plans. There's all this talk about the just transition, but I don't see anybody sitting down and saying, okay, this is how we wean ourselves off coal. And coal, yes, we may be looking at it from a greenhouse gas point of view, but there are multiple ramifications. I mean, there's coal we export. Apart from that, we also evacuate and export some of the power, etc. And all of this is going to be affected by the transition. We're not even doing that. We're not even coming up with pathways. We're not coming up with strategic targets, etc. And in the midst of this, a government not giving a clear direction, it's clearly about the people with money and interest behind them to fund them and actually push their agenda. For me, I'm always surprised, for example, at this bid window 5 and bid window 6, which is purely just wind and solar, when obviously we could be using other forms of energy in the transition, like you rightfully said, natural gas. We may not have domestic sources of natural gas, but globally, it's understood that natural gas is one of those key transitional forms of energy that is expected to encourage net zero. At the same time, it allows you to take some of the existing coal-fired power plants and convert them into gas-run power plants, which have a far less severe impact in terms of greenhouse gases, etc. So I think from a Ubuntunomics point of view and a personal point of view, I don't think that we want to get to the level of denying climate change, etc. I think the causality between, obviously human life and impact on the environment, although people might question it, I think there's definitely clear correlation between the two. But what I argue against, as you've rightfully said, and is this just transition and countries being able to decide for themselves what rules. I'm actually sitting here with, for example, in terms of reference from the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, right, which was putting out a request for proposals for campaigns, and this is to show the interests behind, the dominance and power of wind and solar in the renewables discussions in South Africa. So the terms of reference for South Africa says, and this is one of the key things that they want to do. So the investment would support existing multi-shareholder life after coal coalition, right? So they're trying to create a coalition of like-minded people. And some of the things they're trying to do is to publish studies. The studies that they're looking are for. So the first study is a study on the cost comparison between existing diesel and new gas power plants, a study which is supposed to show that gas is uneconomic and unrequired, and a study which is then going to link jobs to the transition. And I mean, clearly you coming into this not trying to understand what's in the interests of the country, but rather trying to vilify certain sources of energy in the broader mix. The saddest part about this thing is that, whilst everyone, obviously we're focused on this issue of the electricity shortage in South Africa and dealing with the load shedding crisis. But I think the load shedding crisis and a broader issue around the demand for energy needs to be opened up as a discussion. Obviously people, would demand electricity, but if we can get them to have alternative sources, we then reduce the demand and even the supply coming from, coal-fired power plants. If, for example, through the encouragement of gas to power, for example, which will create the stable baseline demand required to then invest in infrastructure that will allow people to not only just get power now from gas to power plants, but also encourage the investment in the infrastructure that will allow them to get natural gas, low pressure gas, LPG, as also one of the alternatives to what most people are actually using as fossil fuels, coal, wood, etc., as their primary energy sources. So, these transition, I think, needs to be considered much broader than the issue, that narrow issue around the greenhouse gas emissions, because, we've published a paper on this already saying that it's quite silly to hamstring and force African countries to have only renewable energy investments in the current and foreseen future, when in fact, even if tomorrow we will go to net zero, Africa would only take away 3% of global greenhouse gases from, global emissions. And so if these development partners really care about African countries, we've said it before and we'll say it again, help us deal with the energy demand and energy supply crisis, and help us become more resilient to climate change and adapt to climate change, rather than forcing us down the path of renewables, which, the advanced economies themselves have been ignoring and kicking the can down the line for over decades now. I mean, the US, being one of the biggest emitters, has refused for decades to sign Kyoto protocols. Now they're championing the cause of renewables because they can see the money involved and them being the key first movers in this transition. But I think if they really want to put their money where their mouth is, they're the ones who should be forced down the line of renewables, rather than forcing it on a continent that contributes no less or no more than 3% of greenhouse gases.
That's 3%. Exactly.
On that note, that takes us to the next story in the essay update, the Expropriation Bill to replace the Expropriation Act of 1975. So the Expropriation Bill has been drafted by the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure after extensive consultations with the assistance of the Senior Counsel and constitutional experts. In South Africa, the Expropriation Act of 1975 provides for the ability of government to acquire or expropriate land for public use and public interest. And the Expropriation Bill is intended to replace the current Expropriation Act of 75 and is supposedly going to be more aligned with the South African Constitution. And this is seen as one of the key steps towards correcting the historic injustice of land ownership patterns in South Africa, as the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform has commissioned 2 studies which show that 79% of African land is in private ownership, whilst 14% is owned by the state, and an additional 7% remains unaccounted for. Khatib, what are your thoughts on this one?
This is probably one of the stickiest issues that anyone can ever imagine to come out of South Africa in recent years. The land issue, for me, is one of those headaches that are going to be with us for quite a long time to come. My view is that it's of no use trying to plaster a big open wound, and instead of taking dilly-dallying on the matter and going around circles. My fear is that this proposed expropriation bill is unlikely to make a dent to the historical injustices, as we are told, of land ownership patterns in South Africa, as you rightly pointed out on the land audit that was done a few years ago, I think 2017. The gap is still wide, and I think it will be interesting to see how the new law will untangle this multi-layered problem. But I personally, I'm not very convinced that this is the right approach. I think we need to go a little bit wider and go a bit deeper and do. And not risk, but I think we need to do some of the unfavorable things in order to solve this problem, because the ownership patterns are not ideal, and this is also frustrating the growth and development in general of the population.
Sure. And I think what's slightly hidden, in the overview, given that, private land forms almost 80%, is not necessarily just the ownership by private government, etc., but also the racial dynamics and the distribution among races. Obviously, that is really the crucial issue, that you've got a population group, white South Africans, which constitute about 10% of the population, which own about 90, if not more, of the actual land mass. And I think it's this unequal distribution where the majority black population are still not landed or do not own land, even though they constitute a majority of the population, which has a significant issue, as you mentioned, on growth and development and the economy and the country as a whole. Smoo?
Well, ordinary South Africans know that this is another inadequate policy trade-off. Instead of dealing with this serious matter, as both of you have said, we should deal with this once and for all. That's my view. No matter how much it costs. What is clear is that land reform in our country will be bogged down in courts. In the courts, every case will be challenged all the way to the apex constitutional court. This expropriation bill circumvents other questions like ownership in traditional in traditional jurisdictions. The case in point, what I'm trying to talk about is the land under chiefs and under the Ingonyama Trust. Then there's also the question of ownership by women, whether they are married or not. Then there's also the question of land, which is deemed to be in ownership for speculative reasons, both urban land and rural land. Again, the courts will be their final arbiters, and we will have drawn out cases. It will become messy. What is curious is the interest the foreign press which have reported on this bill, the interest that they have shown. They view this as an attack on individual property rights, which happen to be the foundation of capitalism. So I ask questions, why this insistence on our part, on Black people's part, or why do we insist on expropriation without compensation? Because we've been saying this and it hasn't worked thus far. Why not pay these former colonialists off? Why prolong the pain and the humiliation of Black people if this is of national importance? The South African Reserve Bank is sitting on a record 1 trillion rand in foreign reserve currency. That to me is a cushion enough. It's more than adequate to do what the South African Central Bank can easily extend, say about 500 billion rand at no interest whatsoever, to pay off outstanding bank mortgages, to pay off that they can buy off big property owners at rates determined by the government's own land valuer general. And so that problem can be solved. But to solve this, it needs we need to think beyond our current restrictions. What I'm saying is that we can use monetary policy to pay off and get this thing sorted once and for all.
It's quite interesting that Sbu is talking about monetary policy as one of the players that can help us unlock this. But we've seen that we've got a very, very reluctant monetary policy aristocrat in our Governor General. I'm a bit afraid that maybe Sbu, you are quite ambitious in that. But going back to using maybe even the fiscus, since 1994, we've tried the willing buyer, willing seller it has not really produced much because there's a lot of money that has been literally wasted in this because of the lack of plan. That there was an insistence that given the necessary support as well as equipment and so on. But I think we are the way that we should be doing. I agree with you, Smu, that perhaps we need to open up the scope beyond the current limitations and look at what is feasible and what is not. But I think at this point we cannot be stuck in the Section 25 debate on private ownership when the whole country is literally falling apart. We can see people are moving from rural areas going to cities and so on. There's quite a lot of settlements. People are moving into those areas and they are taking the land by force. And at the end of the day, in the next 20 years, probably this will be the biggest problem. What if these people now start to move into buildings like in Sentin and so on? What is going to happen? So we need to think about these issues much more seriously than we are doing now. Because as Sia was pointing out earlier on in terms of land ownership, the racial dimensions are creating a big problem because it looks like the race that is having a good share of the land ownership is not willing to make any steps forward. And this is quite sad, in my opinion, because at the end of the day, all of us are going to lose should this problem explode.
Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely. And it's just such a worry. Interesting points that you guys make. I definitely agree with you, Khatebe. I doubt that the Reserve Bank is going to get itself involved in this issue, just mainly because they've taken a side and it's never been on the side of development or the mass black poor population. Then I think secondly is like, I think I agree with you, gentlemen, when you're discussing the issue of, we need to look beyond this expropriation without compensation issue. And I think if the government's plan is to set up the expropriation bill as a way to determine how we value and actually provide compensation for land that should be expropriated, they will have done a service. But if, again, it's more about understanding technicality, because currently, there are two legal views. One which says government can already expropriate given the current constitutional accommodation. There is no need to amend Section 25. It's just that what we've taken as a policy approach has been assumed to be law, because the policy approach of government, as you rightfully say, has been willing buyer, willing seller. But there's no part in the law that requires this. Of course, government can expropriate without compensation. But I think I agree with you. We need to look beyond this and look at a more lasting way of ensuring that we redistribute land in order to ensure that people have stable livelihoods and can actually work themselves out of poverty, because government's not going to provide you a pathway out of poverty, and you cannot get out of poverty without ownership of land. It's a known fact. There are enough studies out there that prove this. And so if the ANC government is serious about dealing with the problem of poverty, then we need to find a way of getting land into black ownership whilst also appeasing the markets and not going down the route of neighboring countries like Zimbabwe, for example, after its own land reform policy sort of backfired and led to the sanctions that have undone the economy. On that note, that takes us to the last story in the SA update for this month, the National Labour Migration Policy. So the Department of Employment and Labour launched the National Labour Migration Policy, the NLMP, on the 5th of October. The NLMP aims to provide a national regulatory framework in line with the international labour standards and regional labour migration frameworks. And the main objective is ensuring that labour migration to and from South Africa is undertaken in the interest of both migrant workers and the domestic economy and society. And the launch took place at the Tripartite Dialogue on Labour and Mixed Migration Governance, where South African officials lamented that home countries do not want to acknowledge and accept the responsibility of migrant labourers who are their citizens. Khatebe, what's your thoughts on this one?
in another platform, I said jokingly that if I were to open a political party to contest elections in 2024, it has to be on a ticket of anti-migrants. And I'm sure that one can get at least 20% of the vote.
Yeah.
But it's one thing that is quite serious that we've seen in Europe, and the Europeans are taking this matter quite serious. So I think that South Africa is more or less in the same space. But on a more serious note, I think that perhaps it's time for South Africa to think creatively about where to find the new sources of growth to create a new economy, and that would provide the new spin-offs in terms of job creation and upliftment of the millions out of poverty. I'm not suggesting that migration is not important, or the problems that we have currently, they are not important. But I suggest that maybe we need to do some other things that are going to help us to move forward. For example, the resetting of the economy that is dominated by the oligopolies, and also that is not living to what the view of Ubuntu economics would like to see, which is inclusivity and fair sharing by everyone. So I think that whatever policy that we create, whether to try and control the influx of labor and illegal immigrants and so on, it's more of a short-term solution. But also, again, I note that the kind of employment understanding or employment intervention that we are always thinking about, it's not always in line with our realities as a country, where we've got a whopping number of less and semi-skilled laborers. Yet, when we talk about labor policy or job creation and so on, this is a mistake that is made even by political parties. We are always concentrating on the tertiary side of the economy, the educated and the top end economic activities like banking, services, and so on. Whereas South Africa has got a large chunk of its labor force still stuck at the bottom in the informality and in low-paying jobs. So, meaning that there is that need for the resetting in our economy before we even think about the illegal immigrants, because the arrival of the least skilled people from the neighboring countries merely compounds the problem. It's not a new problem, and it's a problem that we know that people are leaving their own areas and coming to the cities and other centers, urban centers, to look for work. These are some of the issues that we need to look at with very open eyes. And I'm not sure whether just focusing on labor migration alone is a solution.
Sure. Sbu?
Oh, well, the biggest challenge is what Khadib is alluding to, that of a dichotomous labor market, one black and unskilled, and the other white with high skills. So white businesses prefer fierce competition for low skills jobs, and immigrants tend to compete against locals, who are low skilled, and so. There's this challenge is also has got income inequality, an income inequality dynamic about it, because specialist skills also will come from with immigrants mostly from Europe and Asia. Those immigrants will have the special skills, and they will have internationally competitive high salaries, whereas the low end, it's just a fight to the bottom. Maybe we need to maybe give this a shot, but I don't know. Maybe we need to set emotions aside when we're dealing with this matter of internal migration. I call it internal migration because I think Africa is just one big country that has been divided into all these small parts. And so I think maybe we adopt the Chinese the model as a solution to developmental needs of the people. So maybe bar low-skilled movements, and be strict about it, because the South African worker, as Khatebe has said, is unskilled, and so we need to create jobs for that mass. So that emotions aside, I think.
Yeah, look, I must admit I'm coming from a different angle on this one, and from me it's on two things. I think, firstly, I believe we over-regulate the labor market in South Africa such that there's very little flexibility that actually people with capital are willing to take. For example, there's always this touted issue of, say, the minimum wage, right? And it's always seen as a social justice response to what people are seeing as, unlivable wages that people are being paid. I cannot disagree necessarily with the fact that people are being paid, unlivable wages. But what a minimum wage policy does is that firstly, it raises the cost of labor to the extent that the people employing are not willing to take labor that won't meet a certain level of productivity. So, for example, if you're forced to pay someone, say, 3,000 Rand a month, you want to make sure that they are actually going to perform. And what that means is that for unskilled or inexperienced labor, very few employers are going to take chances on people like that because they don't have what the market sees as signals of your productivity. And so hence we find that people are ending up, like overqualified people, particularly foreigners, are ending up in low-skilled paying jobs, mainly because it's that market differentiator that gives the signal to the employer that this person would be productive. The second issue, I think, is in the historical roots of, the employment and the labor problem in South Africa. I think we don't necessarily take full cognizance of the kind of class struggle that takes place in the workplace. And I think that's mainly because either people are taking the approach of, say, the market fundamentalists, and maybe not a Marxist approach, but also de-emphasizing the history behind this. I think if you look at, for example, the key domains of contestation in the South African political struggle against, firstly, white colonialism, but secondly, the apartheid government, has always been that the first area that you contest on is firstly consumer products. And so it's the consumer boycotts in the Eastern Cape and other regions that were able to bring white business owners to party in terms of negotiating revised settlements in whatever power balance was against the interests of black people. In addition to this, obviously, became the issue of work stayaways and go-slows, right? And hence, in the South African context, there was this feeling that trade unions and organized labor has got too much power and that should be regulated. And as a result, then obviously you've seen a general sort of denigration of trade unions in South Africa. But the point I'm trying to make is that, the employment space, the work environment is part of the political struggle. And so, the work dynamics aren't just about productivity, wages, and, the workers' share of the profits. It's actually also about your political positioning. And so it becomes very difficult in many instances to have a purely business conversation with South African workers, mainly because there's so many sensitivities around who owns the business, the nature and the race of the people who own the business. I mean, all of these dynamics bleed through what ostensibly is a relationship that should be focused on productivity, wages, and, sharing of the profits. And so you're never going to be able to either firstly regulate out those cultural factors, and secondly, you need to understand what the basis of the various struggles within the workplace are in order to find a pathway that encourages people with capital to employ local labor, but also allows local labor to find a position and power to articulate themselves and have a fair share of wages and a share of their profits. That's pretty much my view on the South African labor unemployment issue.
It's a big issue. It's a big topic.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I also noted, I think it's one of the companies, I don't know whether it's Discam, that was talking about equity, employment equity, and so on. And these gaps that we find also within companies where the spread of wages is also so disproportionate to the point that one person earns 24 million rands per annum, and the other person doesn't even make 50,000 rands per year. These are some of these discrepancies that are causing the labor space to be quite contested, and also the other problems. For example, a black worker has to travel more than 100 kilometers to and another 100 from work. There's something that is not sustainable in the way that we are running the economy and the labor market. So this, and I think, I'm very much in line with your thinking that these are the class struggles more than just purely employment business dynamics, but these are much more. These are coming from the broader society. And that's why we've got these problems. Yeah.
Most definitely. And I think the big challenge I think we're all honing on is the fact that you need to deal with issues of employment equity whilst also dealing with issues of high unemployment. And it's quite sad, though, that you're never going to be able to discuss or even consider employment equity whilst you still have crazy, ridiculous unemployment levels. But the problem is that you need to resolve these at the same time and cannot take an approach that says, okay, let's just get everyone employed at even unlivable wages because you're devolving the social problems even further. And, you can't really necessarily get to discuss the issues of employment equity whilst you're still dealing with a huge problem of unemployability. Yeah, it's one of those discussions that we need to probably get into at depth at a later stage. On that note, that brings an end to the essay update for this episode. For all our listeners, regardless of where you are listening through, whether it's on iTunes or Spotify or whatever platform you're listening via, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And if you're enjoying this episode, hit the like and share it amongst your family and friends. That brings us to the Africa Regional Update. And the Africa Regional Update in brief, the ILO appointed its first African Director General, the Togolese Gilbert Ungbo. And the East African community is establishing a diaspora desk to encourage the diaspora to invest in trade and in the region of the East African community. The European Union is preparing a new regional programs to strengthen EU SADC partnerships on the 8th of October, and the ECOWAS Commission meeting on implementation of the Eco Visa was held in Lagos on the 11th to the 13th of October. Meanwhile, the 145th Inter-Parliamentary Union IPU Assembly was held in Kigali on the 11th to the 15th of October, and the 10th East African Petroleum Conference and Exhibition is to be held in Kampala on the 9th to the 11th of May 2023. On that note, that brings us to the first story in the Africa Regional Update, ECOWAS challenges in Burkina Faso, Guinea and Mali. So the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS Summit of Heads of State and Government, convened an extraordinary session in New York on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly to review the situation in Guinea and Mali. On the 61st ECOWAS Ordinary Summit on the 3rd of July in Accra, Summit requested that the mediator for Guinea continue engagements with the transitional authorities in order to arrive at an acceptable transition timetable by August this year. Summit noted that not much progress has been made in arriving at an acceptable transition timetable and decided to impose diplomatic, economic, and financial sanctions against Guinea. Summit also condemned the continuing detention of 46 Ivorian soldiers in Mali and called for their unconditional release. Meanwhile, on the 30th of September, ECOWAS issued a statement condemning the most recent coup in Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso was plunged into a renewed political turmoil when Colonel Paul Henry Sangadao Demiba who seized power in the coup in January this year, was toppled by a coup led by the army captain Ibrahim Traoré. Traoré pronounced that Damiba was removed due to his inability to deal with the armed uprising in the country, which has worsened in recent months. Smoo, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think this challenge has become more than ECOWAS on their own can handle. It should be upgraded to a continental level. There are patterns which can no longer be swept under the carpet. Things like the Islamic insurgents in the Sahel region who render governments dysfunctional because at times they hold and control up to a third of that country's landmass. Secondly, the failure of French intervention, despite their multi-year deployment. And thirdly, there's the Russian influence with the private Wagner group playing a decisive role wherever they are present. They just knock them over. Then there's the failure to grow these economies. We've said this at length. The failure to grow economies and to industrialize these countries south of the Sahel, and the fact that they, in most cases, they have proxy leadership in those countries. Those should be dealt with. Basically, we have the same conditions which were prevalent during the Cold War. You can see Burkina Faso and Mali protesters waving Russian flags and calling for the withdrawal of French forces. And even in one case, the French embassy, which was torched in Ouagadougou. So, they need to up their game, our leaders.
Most definitely, most definitely. Khatebe, your thoughts?
I agree with Sbu that it seems as if Africa is reverting to its default position, inverted commas, of coup d'etats of old. We are back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, without preempting what we are going to be discussing under geopolitics, but it looks like one more time Africa is becoming a battleground between the big forces, although there's no evidence that this is happening, but there are signs that the days of the not so-called Cold War seem to be coming back, and West Africa is a testing ground. And it's interesting that in August, the United States, in its policy for Africa, decided that it was no longer interested in dealing with the insurgents and terrorism. It wanted to expand the scope for discussion, which might have an influence when the Africa-US summit comes up in the later months. But what we are seeing is we are seeing new desert storms flying across the entire Western African region. And I'm not sure whether the ECOWAS or even the AU have got the means to quell this conflict. I am not sure how, if ECOWAS can take the same approach that they had when they deposed or when they intervened in the Gambia a few years ago. So it looks like the equation is much more complex than just going in and taking out those soldiers in Mali or in Burkina Faso. So the security apparatus in the African region is called into play one more time, and I'm afraid that it's not adequately kitted to deal with these kinds of problems. And now with the UN Security Council so polarized between the P2 and the P3, we are unlikely to see those peace missions going in and helping wherever the need is there. So we are going to see a very, very messy situation in Africa, and which is going to take us another decades back. And I'm afraid that this is going to happen. And the more the geopolitical rivalry continues, is the more Africa is likely to lose out. So, and also the other countries that were given Africa, let's say your donor funding and other aid, they are also struggling. They have got their own internal struggles. We are going to deal with the British and the Europeans later on, but it's clear that we are not going to get anywhere. So I'm really showing open pessimism. It's not being Afro pessimist, but it's not Afro pessimism on my part, but I fear that there is something big happening that we might not be able to contain.
Yeah, my biggest concern in all of this is the fact that the coups have now taken on a different dynamic in that they've got public support. What we saw in the Malian coup as well as the Burkina Faso coup is the fact that there was actually popular support for the military juntas that took over because of the deterioration of the general national security challenge. That, the African leadership crisis has led to so much insecurity that people in the public domain are now backing the military juntas. And I think that's a difficult space because it becomes difficult to roll back these military juntas, whether that be an intervention from outside or local, because it loses then the justification and the justice basis of ensuring public security and ensuring democratic elected leaders come into power when the public opinion of the military juntas is positive. On that note, that takes us to the next story in the Africa Regional Update. The East African Community deals with the Ebola outbreak in Uganda. So the East African Community Secretariat has urged the EAC partner states to enhance emergency preparedness and response activities following an outbreak of Ebola virus disease, EVD, in Uganda. So health authorities in Uganda have declared an outbreak of Ebola after a case of Sudan Ebola virus was confirmed in Mubende district in the central part of the country. And at the end of September last month, there were 4 confirmed deaths and a total of 34 EVD case patients, and 16 of whom were confirmed positive of EVD. Spoo?
Well, say Uganda has been here before. They have the skills and the experience to take care of this crisis. I don't know why they have been so complacent. You can't expect South Sudan or the DRC to lead the charge. Uganda should play a senior role. The government of Uganda should provide all the essentials like PPE as a matter of course. You can't expect doctors without gloves or just rudimentary PPE equipment. You send them out to die. I don't know. I'm just frustrated by this.
Yeah. Look, again, I'll try and find the silver lining. I hope that given that this comes on the heels of the COVID-19 pandemic, that hopefully the country and the region has some extra supplies of personal protective equipment, but also that, with the most recent pandemic, they should have established their viral testing and, other means of responding to these medical emergencies. And I hope that, unlike previous outbreaks, which the country has been able to deal with and resolve, that this is probably one of their most prepared times in terms of being able to deal with the crisis. On that note, that takes us to the last story in the Africa Regional Update, the SADC preliminary statement on elections in Lesotho. So the SADC Electoral Observer Mission, the SEOM, launched the SEOM for the Kingdom of Lesotho's national elections, which were held on the 7th of October, upon invitation extended by the Independent Electoral Commission of the Kingdom of Lesotho, and in line with the revised SADC principles and guidelines governing democratic elections. The SEOM to the 2022 National Assembly elections in Lesotho was comprised of 63 delegates and observers who were deployed in all 10 districts of Lesotho. The SEOM observed that political parties and independent candidates were able to freely campaign towards elections and that pre-election and voting phases were calm and peaceful. The SEOM also urged the government of Lesotho to prioritize the review of reforms to strengthen democracy, peace, security, stability, and good governance in the Kingdom of Lesotho. Smoo?
For starters, I think the intervention by SADC, led by President Cyril Ramaphosa, who was tasked tasked with ensuring peace, stability, and general reforms must be commended. He's got a sweet tongue, Shem. He's got a sweet tongue. We have seen many times how the armed forces of that country have destabilized their political landscape. And secondly, Basotho have matured, and so has their own variation of democracy, with all those coalition governments and all of that. So I think they should be commended also. Thirdly, there is a move away from traditional parties towards new upstarts even. This is a curious development in the subcontinent, that is SADC. We saw how Zambian youths turned electoral fortunes away from the old and tested but failed old parties, and now this new kid on the block in Lesotho. So that's a positive also. What will be interesting to observe though is how pro-business this coalition will be, or how pro-West it will be. In any case, Basotho have chosen, and the SADC Electoral Observer Mission must be applauded for their role. It's a positive.
Yeah, most definitely. And it's a tough time, so it's a good end to end on a positive note in the Africa Regional Update. For all our listeners, regardless of where you are listening through, whether it's on iTunes or Spotify or whatever platform you're listening via, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And if you're enjoying this episode, hit the like and share it amongst your family and friends. On that note, that takes us to a new segment, the Global Geopolitics Update. So, the Global Geopolitics Update in brief. The World Bank Food Security Update lists Zimbabwe, Rwanda, and Ghana as amongst the highest food price inflation countries on the 3rd of October. And the IMF estimates that Ukraine needs $4 billion a month for government operations on the 10th of October. Meanwhile, former UK Minister of Finance Kwasi Kwarteng was replaced by Jeremy Hunt on the 14th of October. And the International Conference on Ukraine Reconstruction is scheduled for the 25th of October. Meanwhile, the United Nations Security Council Counterterrorism Committee scheduled to meet on the 28th and 29th of October. And on the 30th of October, Brazil is scheduled to have runoff elections. On that note, that takes us to the first story in the geopolitics update. The 77th UN General Assembly. The 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly, the UN UNGA 77, took place on the 13th to the 27th of September in Washington, D.C. This year's theme acknowledges the shared roots of crises such as COVID-19, climate change, and conflict, and the need for solutions that build global sustainability and resilience. The UNGA 77 comes at a crucial moment for climate change and conflict and the future of the planet. Khateb, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, this is quite an interesting period for the United Nations, multilateralism and cooperation in general. The backdrop of the current settings is characterized by the decline in the reliance on multilateralism, as well as it seems as if globalization is losing its status as a flavor of the month, as the world is moving towards geopolitical rivalry. We will take note that since the end of the World War II, and with the creation of the Bretton Woods in 1944, that is the IMF and the World Bank, the world economy has been driven from the economic side, and politics sort of took a back seat, and everybody was loading globalization, which means that we need to integrate markets, free movement of people, free movement of capital, spread of production across the globe, and so on and so forth. Of course, there were tinges of geopolitics in between when we talk about what the West would call the Cold War, of which was not cold for us in Africa. But now we see also the issues of nationalism, border disputes, economic protectionism, and so on. But the geopolitics sort of took a backseat, as I said, and we saw that in the late 90s, late 80s, when the USSR fell apart. There was the effort to accelerate cross-border capital flows, labor, products, and ideas, and this led to the creation of the NATO as the first regional bloc or trading bloc in North America. It's NAFTA, not NATO. Also, the consolidation of the WTO as a leading voice in how the trade had to be conducted in this globalized world, but also the solidification of a united Europe through the European Union sort of set an example for other regions of the world as to how to go about with this integration, where countries would literally sacrifice their sovereignty and opt to co-govern and share the burden. Well, all of us were encouraged, and we thought that this was the way to go. Many other regional blocs sprang up. If you think of Mercosur, ASEAN, African Union, SADC, just to name a few, meaning that trade, finance, and economics seem to trump everything as big corporations relocated their production units to different parts of the world, especially in Asia and other selected places, in Latin America to a lesser extent, to take advantage of cheap labor costs and sometimes less stringent labor laws and laws in general that could be easily circumvented, of which this created other problems like illicit financial flows, the flouting of labor rules, and so on and so forth. And what we saw was that people started to seek relief through the law to get these companies to pay for whatever problems that they were causing in those countries, but with little success, of course. And in fact, what mattered more for the global community, as we refer to it, was more the bottom line, what the companies were making. And as a result, the world saw itself divided between the poor and the ultra-rich. And this was a source of tension. But what was clear is that the architects of this global financial system did not anticipate that the old problems, including nationalism, economic booms and busts, were going to come back. Inequality, competition for rapidly declining resources, as well as ecological problems, were going to come back and haunt us. And what has also exacerbated the problem is the decline of the old powers, as we see with Britain, as well, and now with the birth of the new ones, with China leading the charge against the old order. So this political reordering or multipolarism, as others will call it, has got a growing Chinese influence, which is changing the rules literally. It sits it's more like a boxing match where you have got the US sitting in the blue corner, defending their long unchallenged position in politics and commerce and trade. Then with China in red, gaining ground in world politics, and also in trying to change the rules of the game. For example, the other corner of the US and the West spoke about free markets. China is coming with another type of capitalism, which is state-centric, and this is causing a lot of tension. So now what the General Assembly had to deal with is quite a sad situation, because in almost all the platforms that are taking place at the moment, they are quite preoccupied with a geopolitical contest that is taking place, whereas the world really needs solutions to solve the problems that we have covered in the other segments that we've already discussed. So we are seeing that in the next few weeks, we are going to have the COP27 in Egypt. It is unlikely that there would be any decision made, because there would be preoccupation with the geopolitics, the war, particularly the war in Ukraine. We are already seeing that the G20 is not even able to reach a single agreement in Indonesia because of this geopolitical division. So it's a very interesting period, and what was discussed at UNGA will be taken to Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, particularly the issues of climate change. And it would be interesting how the Western countries are going to handle the presence of China and Russia in those meetings that are coming in the next few weeks. So my perspective on geopolitics is that it's really reshaping the world, and you'll see we are going to still discuss the IMF and the World Bank, but the issue here is that the big state is taking the center stage, as we saw it during COVID.
Yeah. Smooth, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, well, like Khatebe has said, I also observed a world that refuses to entertain the idea of multi-polarism. The current hegemony is still very strong. They are pushing and cajoling supposedly independent states to adopt certain positions which are favorable to the West or the G7. And there are threats of retaliation should they not vote a certain way. I mean, even Saudi Arabia was threatened by the US after they voted a certain way at their cartel, at the oil cartel. So my view is that real issues take a backseat. Geopolitical power play takes a center stage, like Khatebe was saying, to the detriment of global sustainability. Because, it is a fact that the world needs to move forward with our with all the targets. I also observed a disjointed Africa that does not present. They don't present a united front, especially the West African guys, Ghana, for example. And I was pleased by the courage of South Africa. They put forward a considered stance informed by values, and they chose to abstain rather than be duplicitous. Okay, all right, that word, duplicitous. I also noted I also noted how other countries are pariahs and no one bothers to pull them in. And I saw a steely determination by a very small country, Nicaragua, who voted against the dominant forces. So the Nicaragua story gives me some hope. South Africa gives hope. I'm disappointed at Ghana, and I'm disappointed that global sustainability is not being pursued with the vigor that is needed here.
Yeah, no. I must admit, I agree with you, gentlemen, wholeheartedly. And, the challenge is that the new challenges, we entered a new paradigm now. I think this is slightly different from issues where, for example, we may have been dealing with starvation in Africa, previous historic African coups, or even the breakup of the USSR. I think in this paradigm we're in, it's global issues and have a global impact, which require collective and multilateral solutioning in terms of the response. If you think of COVID-19, it was one of, we also come from the 2008 global financial crisis, right? And now the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change being the next big crisis. And I think the next recessions, are going to be the next issue. And it's quite sad that, multilateralism has been weakened by these geopolitical jostlings, but also, as you rightfully mentioned, the key issues that matter are not being discussed as we see a lot of power struggles amongst those who consider themselves at least hegemons in this, global politics of ours. On that note, that brings us to the last story in the geopolitics update, the 2022 annual meetings. The 2022 annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank Group, WBG, took place from the 10th to the 16th of October in Washington, D.C. The IMF's projections for global growth in 2023 is 2.7%, and this is the fourth downgrade in less than 12 months. There's a 25% chance also that growth will come in below 2% this year. Global markets have been extremely volatile, and the risk of a recession is rising in many economies. The biggest immediate challenge for central banks is bringing down inflation, and many central banks have rapidly tightened their monetary policy. However, this will lead to slower and weaker economic growth and higher unemployment as monetary tightening ratchets up. This means that the correct fiscal response is important in order to deal with the policy incoherence resulting from the current monetary policy responses. And the IMF asserts that governments need to protect the vulnerable households with targeted measures to alleviate the impact of rising food and fuel prices. Khatem, what are your thoughts on this one?
Oh, yeah, this is a difficult period once more. When it comes to the global economy. Picture was started by the World Bank President David Malpass when he addressed an event at the University of Stanford. I think he was even more daring because he talked about stagflation prospects in all major economies, which are likely to have a negative spillover to the developing world. And this is where we are getting nerves, so to say, because it means that our goal towards industrialization and development will have to be moved to the backseat while we deal with the economy that is unrivaling. But what is also very interesting is that the DFIs, including the IMF and the World Bank Group, they are talking about the loans that they are busy pumping to the developing countries, which means that at the end of the day, there are many countries, including South Africa, Zambia, Pakistan, and so forth, are being overburdened with these loans. You know the story about the Chinese loans that had been extended to African countries. So it means that by the time this crisis ends, if ever it comes to an end, Africa will still be at the bottom and the developing world at large because of the indebtedness that they would be carrying. So, but in any case, this projection of 2.7 growth for 2023. For me, it doesn't come as a surprise, but I think somebody might be a little bit generous. I don't know if the figures are going to be as high, because we are sitting in a multiplicity of problems as we speak. We are talking low growth, unemployment, high food prices, fuel costs are going through the roof, as well as conflict, and also the other old problems of our country's failure to provide for the needy, especially children who are still trapped in poverty and illiteracy. So I am quite pessimistic about the role that the IMF and the World Bank will and are going to be able to play in the current crisis, because my observation over the years is that it looks like their toolbox is only full of equipment and materials that are suited for the developing countries. I mean, it's easy when Argentina goes through a recession or experiences high inflation to be given a loan and be instructed to embark on major cuts in terms of their fiscal spending and so on. But the economic turmoil in Britain exposes some of these old problems that these countries have been complaining about. But moreover, we've got fears that we might be going into something that is worse than 2008. A second play of a Lehman Brothers collapse, where now Credit Suisse and Deutsche Bank they are seen as the weakest links in the whole process. For example, Credit Suisse, with a market capitalization of just $10 billion, is indebted up to 90 billion. So you wonder what is happening. What happened to their commitments in terms of the minimum capitalization that is prescribed by the Basel, the BIS? So we are sitting in a very, very thorny part of the world. So, but the British one is something that we need to all follow with close intent and attention, because it's likely to escalate and affect other parts of the world, as we have seen that the sterling has gone beyond below the dollar for the first time in about 40 years. So which means that there is a serious crisis going on there. But they are blaming the new government, the new Prime Minister, Madame Truss, for not understanding economics. But I feel that there are serious problems that are coming up. So the problems are spreading. And what makes even things worse is that the secessionist group, what you call multipolarism, Mr. Nyati, is that the Chinese and the Russians, they seem to be creating their own spaza shop somewhere else, trying to detach from the dollarized economy. And so now we are seeing a lot of disagreements. So geopolitics once more is driving the economic decisions. We are going to have a very, very interesting bumpy period in the next 3 months, when the APEC sits in Thailand and when the G20 sits in Indonesia and COP, as I said. Oh, and of course, our FIFA World Cup in Qatar. All of these are likely to fall flat because of these thorny issues that we've just outlined. So the discussions are not possible at the moment, and it means that economics and economic discussions are basically out of the window, as everybody's trying to survive. Everybody's focusing on internal solutions. Everybody's trying to duck the bullet as the two guys, the two big guns are fighting. So it's going to be an interesting period going forward. I think 2023 is going to be fun. I do not know whether it's the right choice, but we are going to have a serious situation that we'll have to contend with. Food, energy, everything, we are going to see the decline, including the rand or our economy going down as well. We've seen that the rand is now even below the kwacha. So yeah, we are going to a very interesting period, gentlemen. And I think the DFIs do not seem to have a solution in this regard. And the meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, I don't think they even came close to even dealing with the problem that we have at hand.
Most definitely.
You know, these guys have to be honest with themselves. You know, back in 2013, 2014, the oil price was at more than $100 per barrel. So they're blaming the energy crisis for all of this inflation. But there was no inflation back then in 2013, 2014, and the oil price went down from about 2015 to about 2019, and it almost hit $25 per barrel. That's when Sasol, the South African company, was in trouble, and it shot up again as soon as all those restrictions around COVID-19 were lifted, and so even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the price of per barrel was around about $100 back in 2021. So there's no correlation between the price, the fuel price, the energy price, and inflation. So what they could be talking about is China going into shutdown and supply side constraints. They experienced supply side constraints at the back end of 2021, and Europe is experiencing supply side constraints. This has got nothing to do with monetary policy and whatnot. This has got to do with the real economy. They have not invested on the supply side of the economy, and that is what has come to hit. The Russian matter is just an addition. Anyway, I just wanted to point to those.
I think 100%, Spoo, you hit the nail on the head. They're just scapegoating the Russian issue right now, the Ukrainian issue, as the reason behind this inflation and rising fuel and food prices. It doesn't even begin to touch the real thing behind it. I want to add the fact that, the US printed over $6 or $7 trillion, right, in response to COVID-19 over the last 2 years. That's almost like a third of the economy size of the US, right? At a time when global value chains were in disarray, at a time when there's so much problems on the supply side, you're adding another $7 trillion in demand. Obviously you're going to lead to hyperinflation. There's just no other way around it. You've clearly got too much money chasing too few goods. Supply side breaking down, you're not producing as much. At the same time, you're pumping in another $7 or $6 trillion to chase after goods that aren't being produced. You're going to end up with inflation, no doubt. And I think that's really the cause of the inflation, and not necessarily what we're seeing with the Russia and the Ukrainian conflict. Not to say that hasn't had an impact, but I think it's like one of those cases. SADC countries, and South Africa included, were struggling long before the COVID-19 pandemic. And now, obviously, with the pandemic, things have gotten worse. But if you listen to most politicians, they're now blaming the pandemic for all the economic challenges we're faced with. And that's definitely not the case.
Yeah, but look at Britain also, Sia, because the Bank of England was amongst those that went on the printing spree during COVID, and now they don't seem to have a response to what is happening. So that is quite a very practical example that we are seeing, that Britain is one of the culprits. And they did this with impunity. Even ever since 2008, the central banks have not been developing good monetary policy instruments that were supporting growth, that were supporting a new direction in the economies. What they've done, like in Japan and so on, they've just been ramping up stock, buying up stock of these big companies. And now when these big companies are not doing well, what do you do? What do you do?
Yeah.
So we've got a big problem. I think this is a complacency that who is talking about. The policymakers, monetary policymakers and others have been very complacent throughout, because they thought they can or they could. So now when the cold bites them now, they are now looking for scapegoats. But I think the problem is from within. Yeah.
And I must add a last point, because we are heterodox in terms of our approach from an economics point of view. But Ubuntunomics has been quite clear. Whilst most of the left-leaning economists have been saying, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, that government must intervene with monetary financing to fund government expenditure, etc. We've been in line with that, right? We've supported that, but have been very clear that whatever concessional funding coming from the monetary and monetary policy authority, from central bank, for example, needn't be spent on social programs, creating basic income grants, etc. No, we've said that funding needs to be spent on productive means, providing concessional funding for productive means. And I think what this is actually drawing a line in the sand on is a lot of the left-leaning economists who think that a response of just printing money is going to solve the developmental challenges. And I want to firstly say the case in point of the US and the Bank of England and where they find themselves now is proof of that, in support of obviously the conservatives such as the Reserve Bank governor in South Africa. But I want to be clear again that, what we're presenting as Ubuntunomics as a response that the government should take that is sort of heterodox and sort of non-mainstream is not necessarily printing money to provide grants or to provide basic income, but actually printing money or providing concessional funding for productive and export-led activities, and also transformation, of course, linked to productive activities.
Yes, yeah. All the central banks throughout the world have been constraints at getting demand growing. Now that it's in the doldrums, now that they don't have the tools with which they cannot act, because they have not imagined a supply side constraints. So yeah.
On that note, that brings an end to the geopolitics update for this month. And that brings us to the numbers game.
Yeah, okay.
All right. Our number for this month is 19.1%. Khatebe, we'll give you a chance to guess what this number is related to.
I have to take a wild guess, and I'm thinking it's the depreciation of the rand.
Interesting. It could be possible, but not exactly. So close, but no cigar. Spoo?
19.1%. That would be production. We've dropped production in the mining. Some sort of production. Let me not say mining. Say manufacturing dropped by 19.1%. That is a big number.
Another interesting one, which it doesn't sound far-fetched given the load shedding problem, etc. But no, again, I think close but no cigar. So actually, this number is about Nelson Mandela Metro's dam levels. So the Department of Water and Sanitation, as a reservoir report, shows a slim reduction in storage. So at the end of September, the national storage capacity of country's reservoirs was at 89.7%, which is a significant improvement from last year's 78.8%. The country's largest water supply system, the Integrated Vaal River System, the IVRS, which comprises of 14 dams across 4 provinces, was at 94.5% of its capacity. Meanwhile, Cape Town water supply recorded a decline in water levels to 85.7% after months of rainy winter. And the Algoa water supply system, whose dams supply the Nelson Mandela Metro, have increased levels to 19.1%. And 8 out of the 9 provinces are experiencing reductions in water levels, with the exception of Gauteng, which is also the smallest in terms of dam capacity in the country. So there you have it, folks. The Algoa water supply system sitting at 19.1%.
We were thinking economics, you can see.
I had to come at an angle you guys wouldn't expect. Look, there are rumors.
You did well, eh?
Yeah. Look, there are rumors that after the energy crisis we're currently faced, that the next global crisis is going to be about water. And so this story really for me is about looking down the line and seeing what's coming and our ability to plan and resolve this crisis before it gets out of hand.
There's a backlog. They say there's a backlog of about R1 trillion in maintenance and repairs to our infrastructure. That's not building new dams, just the existing infrastructure.
Very, very, very concerning and worrying. All right, gentlemen. On that note, that brings an end to the episode this month.
Thank you.
Thank you, brother.